Soon after dawn on a totally calm and idyllic Littleton harbour, a boat was found drifting abandoned near the northern shore. The Coast Guard towed the mysterious craft into the port, and police discovered its owner was 49-year-old businessman and journalist John Buxton.
We went out looking for quite a wee while afterwards around the harbour, just looking, but there was nothing.
A search of the sea and the shoreline could find no body, nor any clue as to what John's fate was. John Buxton had simply disappeared.
Well, of course, the first thing you think of is that he may have committed suicide.
He had written a letter to a friend, and it was officially accepted that John had taken his own life at sea. But there are a great many things about John's disappearance that simply don't add up.
None of it makes sense. The shaving off of the beard, the going out in the harbour, none of it does. It's all very peculiar. It's like having these pieces of the puzzle and none of them fit together.
Did John Buxton manage to fool everyone and simply disappear to start a new life?
I see this guy looking at me. I look at him and I thought, gee, that looks like it could be John Buxton.
Using new scientific knowledge, psychological analysis and forensic artistry, The Missing investigates what really happened to John Buxton.
To some extent, he's deliberately set circumstances up to be ambiguous.
The last confirmed sighting of John Buxton was on the afternoon of the 1st of June 1984. He arrived with his boat in tow at the sleepy seaside village of Diamond Harbour.
I was working at the Diamond Harbour post office and this guy came in rather late, just as I was closing the mail, and wanted to post a parcel. It was a large square box, and the funny thing about it that I remember was it was wrapped in newspaper, and that was most unusual, I thought.
There was another curious aspect that Louise Blatchford vividly recalls that day.
He had a lot of money, seemed to me to be a lot of money with the rubber band around it. Normally most people pay for things, get their money out of their wallet or their pocket, and it was quite a wad of money.
John had recently sold a work truck for $7,000, which may have explained the large roll of cash. Throughout the whole exchange in the post office, John remained silent.
He looked like he didn't want to be interrupted. He was, just sort of daydreaming, and I was sort of, willing him to hurry up because I wanted to close the post office and get home. And he just seemed to take his time and gave me the parcel, and off he went.
This was the last confirmed sighting of John Buxton. The following morning, his boat was found in Littleton Harbour, and police contacted his ex-wife, Annette.
I didn't know what to think. I didn't know whether he had committed suicide, whether it had been a genuine accident, or whether he'd done a disappearing act. I didn't know what to think.
Authorities determined that John Buxton had committed suicide. However, he had just landed a new job in Wellington, which he'd proudly told his friends about.
I really couldn't understand it. It was completely odd, unusual, out of character, I thought, because it seemed to be so upbeat.
Family and friends believed there could be more to the mystery of John's disappearance, and their suspicions deepened shortly after he'd gone missing, when Annette went to his house.
When I cleared out the flat, there was the fact that he had got quotes to shift all his stuff up to Wellington. There were wet leather boots inside, and the keys to the flat were in his jacket.
Initially, Annette suspected the police had brought these things back to the flat, but they had not.
The suspicion is there that he did not perhaps drown in the harbour, that he found a way to get back to his flat and dropped the keys off. And, maybe changed his clothes, wet boots.
There are many anomalies in the disappearance of John Buxton, and forensic psychiatrist Eric Monasterio agrees that this case warrants a closer look.
If he had carefully considered this behaviour leading up to, let's say, a suicide, why had he left it up to the last minute to post his important belongings just at the closing time of the post office shop in Diamond Harbour? The only other option to my mind is, if he wasn't at the last minute trying to post his belongings, he obviously wanted to be cited. And I wonder whether that's important or not, whether in his own mind he wanted a last person to know where he was departing from.
Could John have staged his own disappearance? And what would have motivated him to take such a drastic course of action? John Buxton went missing in 1984 in Lyttelton Harbour in what initially looked like a suicide. But why would a man take his own life after building an accomplished career in journalism?
He was always good at writing. He won all the English competitions, all the English prizes at school.
Yeah, he was very, very bright. I think he was probably over intelligent, super intelligent in the sense of the mind that he had. On one hand, it served him well. On the other hand, I think it tortured him in a lot of things too. I think a lot of people who are very bright have that problem, and he did have that problem.
Early in his career, John led a rather nomadic existence as he moved from town to town, working for different papers. In 1966, he married Annette, and they settled in Nelson, where John set up his own publication.
Then, at one stage later on, he started his own country newspaper, which was a giveaway newspaper in Nelson.
John also had a passion for expensive machines, especially sports cars and boats.
Oh, he was just a car buff and a boat buff, really. Yeah, he just liked cars and boats.
He wouldn't be satisfied just with an ordinary car. Couldn't bear to run around in the box on four wheels. He wanted something unusual like himself, I guess.
Fortunately, John was also very resourceful, and he taught himself to fix and build things.
Very practical with his hands, yes. He could fix a car, pull the engine apart, put it back together again. He was good with his hands with timber or anything, really. Before I met him, he had built a two-ton yacht up in Taupo. He was very proud of that.
He did quite a lot of building of his own house and repairs and alterations, and he was always interested and keen to do those sort of things, and he made a good job.
John was resourceful, skilled and intelligent. These attributes have led some to suggest he would have no problem staging his own disappearance and surviving undetected.
Would he have the capacity to do that? Yes, I think he would have. He was a smart guy, and he could have just said, right, that's it, I'm just got to get out of here, and I think he could have had that capacity because to an extent he was quite a loner in his early years, so he could have just easily slipped away.
In fact, John had previously practiced a disappearing act of sorts. As a teenager, John boarded at John McGlashan College in Dunedin, where he became known as an eccentric and unconventional boy.
Even then, he was a very unusual person. To leave the boarding establishment, he had a disguise that he wore and an old bicycle. So he put on his disguise, I can't remember what it was, an old lady or something. And then he'd take off on his bicycle and he'd just leave the boarding house whenever he wanted to.
Those who knew John have speculated that his disappearance may be another case of leaving when he wanted to. But John Buxton has not been seen for 27 years, and it's very difficult to simply up and vanish without trace. And there are aspects of John Buxton's disappearance that do lead towards the suicide theory. In spite of his positive attributes, he was known to have volatile qualities.
He certainly had mood swings. We would occasionally invite him round for a meal with some guests, and he'd have the whole assembly convulse, people rolling on the floor laughing. But the next time you invited him round, he could be quite moody and morose, hardly say a word, glum in the corner.
He could be, as Peter said, the life of the party, and then he could be, the next time we had dinner guests, he could be so rude.
Yes, you would have to say he did have eccentric moments. And he had a bit of a temper as well. Not that I ever saw him take it out on any person or animal. But he would take it out on inanimate objects that in his fury he might throw on the floor and jump on. Such as maybe his glasses, and then he couldn't see, which seemed to me to be particularly stupid.
Despite his practical skills and intelligence, John did not have a head for business, and in the years leading up to his disappearance, both his personal and work life faced major setbacks, which began when his Nelson newspaper went under.
It eventually failed, and I gather it failed because the advertisers wouldn't pay their bills, and they were probably borrowed a lot of money to start, just couldn't keep going. But it sort of went bankrupt. He was a good journalist, but not a good businessman, I guess.
In the early 1970s, John and Annette Buxton moved to Christchurch and soon set up a new business, Mini Mix Concrete, which John managed full-time. Leaving the intellectual world of writing wasn't an easy transition for him.
It always dumbfounded me. What was he doing operating a concrete plant? What was he doing managing Minimix or owning Minimix when he was so bright? It's like he seemed so out of place.
John used to come in here often at sort of tea time, dead beat in his old clothes, sort of saying, I can barely stand up, I've been dipping cement into the hopper all day and we've been so busy. But it never seemed to produce the monetary results.
It was planned, but it wasn't planned to perfection, you might say. He wasn't a wonderful business person.
I think the business was always teetering on a knife edge, and that created stresses, and when things didn't go quite right and concrete got spilled in the wrong places or there was too much put in the bowl, the wheels would fall off.
As problems grew at work, John's mood swings also increased.
He could just turn on a dime and the next thing he's another person.
He used to get beetroot red in the face and scream in the middle of the batching plant, and he'd occasionally throw hammers across the plant, and there was one incident when he drove the big front end loader into a wall out of sheer frustration.
He loved a drama and he was quite often at the centre of it, from what I remember. I used to laugh, I think it was funny. I used to think he was funny when he was having one of his rages, and the guys who worked for him, they kind of have a bit of a laugh about it as well.
But Minimix was sliding into debt, and John was soon facing another business collapse. Authorities believed this financial failure pushed him over the edge to suicide when John took his frostbite yacht onto Lyttelton Harbour at dusk on a cold winter day.
I remember sort of thinking, with reflection, what's he doing?
John was an extremely experienced sailor, and conditions on the water were calm.
Well, he wasn't a wonderful swimmer. He was a good yachtsman, though. Good boatie. Knew what he was about.
John's boating skills and the state the craft was found in meant that it was exceedingly unlikely he had an accident. Authorities deemed that John had most likely taken his own life by drowning at sea. If he really had committed suicide, then there are two scenarios to consider. Firstly, that John simply stepped off the boat into the water. Or secondly, that he'd weighed himself down before plunging into the sea. To understand how the human body reacts in the freezing winter ocean, we talked to local search and rescue expert Del Hurley.
What people probably don't realise is that you don't necessarily die from hypothermia because you're immersed in water. And people think, the arms and the legs just get cold. The thing is, they actually seize up and they can't do anything to stop themselves sinking.
It would have been dark on the harbour and no one would have seen him. And without a life jacket on in chilly waters, John could have perished within a couple of hours. But as the conditions were still and settled, his body should have been found. The second suicide scenario, which could explain why no corpse was recovered, would be if John weighed himself down.
You have to have some decent weight to pull you down, because if you take sea water in immediately, even if you go face down, your body will put some buoyancy in itself, because when the seawater goes through, it closes itself off and you'll have air trapped in there.
If someone weighs themselves down, there are two reasons why their body might not be found in Littleton Harbour.
In this area here, within about 12 hours, the sea lice will start having a go at you. Within 24 hours, they'll seriously go to work on you. If somebody went down in the channel, you could get a situation where the big ships just churn them up.
Any weight dropped into this harbour sinks into a thick layer of silt on the seabed. The channel has also been regularly dredged since 1984 and the sediment dumped in the shallow edges of the harbour. This means that if John Buxton had used a weight to assist in suicide, we have virtually no chance of finding it now. However, there are major issues with the suicide at sea theory. The boat's position when it was found, the weather conditions, and the tidal flows for that day. John's empty boat was first spotted drifting very close to the northern shore of the harbour. The sail was not set, and as there was virtually no wind that night or the next morning, the tidal flows would be the prime mover of the boat. Using computer modelling, consultant hydrologist Derek Goring has analysed different possible boat positions.
So here's the first one. Let's say the boat left here at 5 o'clock and got out into the middle of the channel, so we can step through and see where the boat would have gone. Midnight it would have been right out at Adley Head, turned around as the tide changed and came back in again. If that had been the case, at 9 o'clock next morning, he would have ended up here. But in fact his boat was found over here, over the other side of the harbour, so that's obviously not a correct scenario. So let's have a look at a different scenario, maybe positioning him over that side of the harbour just to see if that would be a more reasonable scenario. Now in this part of the harbour, both sides, the currents are much smaller than they are in the middle, and so he'd move much less. So in this scenario, here he is over here at 7 o'clock. He would move backwards and forwards along this coastline, ending up at 9 o'clock at Livingston Bay where he was found.
If John took his own life, you would expect he would go overboard in the middle of the channel where the harbour is the deepest. But these calculations point to the boat being abandoned very close to shore in shallow water. The boat's position suggests that instead of drowning at sea, John simply got out of the boat and pushed it back into the harbour.
The boat was found very close to the shore, so the police said. And the police said, well, it was so close to the shore that he could have got off and caught a bus.
I understand that in the boat there was some food, some scraps of food left behind, and that seems strikingly unusual. It would be very rare behaviour for people to have a meal or have something to eat immediately before committing suicide.
John Buxton disappeared in 1984. Looking back in his past for clues as to why he went missing, the late 1970s mark a time when his life started to decline. His first disappointment was when he attempted to reconcile with his mother, who had virtually abandoned him as a child.
I think he really regretted the fact that he really didn't have a family.
I know that he had quite a difficult childhood and quite a sad childhood, and you could see that in him a lot.
John Buxton's family was something of overachievers. Successful, established and of considerable wealth, John had always been proud of his heritage and felt some entitlement to it. But as a 2-year-old, his parents separated. John never saw his father again, and his mother Emily lost interest in her son. John was shunted between family members in New Zealand and East Africa.
They enrolled him in boarding school in Nairobi, and after he got malaria 3 times in quite short succession. The doctors over there said that he probably wouldn't survive another one, so that he really needed to come back home. So his mother put him on a boat for New Zealand, and on his own this was, and I think he was probably only about 11 or 12, and he came all the way back on his own.
He'd been raised mostly by his grandmother, Honey, and his great-aunt, Emily Seiderberg, New Zealand's first female doctor.
He was fond of Aunt Emily. His mother and his stepfather, I think he was more ambivalent to.
John's relationship with his mother remained troubled.
I have to say it was a strained relationship, really. I think he regretted the fact that he didn't have any family there with him when he was growing up.
I had forgotten about how he was treated by his mum and things like that. And I mean, in some ways, he should have been a far worse person and more mixed up than he was. I think everybody deserves to be loved.
Whilst childhood experiences don't determine the way you come out as a person, they certainly strongly contribute to what you're likely to end up having to deal with. So from the perspective of there being quite a lot of instability in his childhood, difficulties with attachment, you may say that he was much more likely to have difficulty settling down in himself as an adult.
These issues of abandonment may have come to a head when John tried to reconnect with his mother as an adult.
I was trying to get him sort of on better frame of mind with his mother, and I suggested that he sent her a birthday gift. The response was a letter from her solicitor that said, if you wish to communicate any further with your mother, I suggest you do it through me. So I guess that was the end of the road as far as that was concerned.
In 1978, John suffered another blow when his marriage to Annette ended, although they remained friends. Those close to John began to see a more dramatic and darker side of his character.
John would be the sort of person who would ring us up on a Sunday morning or on the weekend or whatever, and he would say he was having a bad time and he was going to kill himself. And I used to think, what the hang? Quick, let's go in there. And Brian would say, no, don't worry about it, he'll get over it. And then he'd ring back half an hour later to tell us that off because we hadn't gone in there. He was such a lonely man. He seemed lonely and alone and kind of, I don't know, always separate. He was there, but he wasn't there. Do you know what I mean? He was with you, but he wasn't with you.
While John continued to run Minimix Concrete, he maintained a love of writing and hinted that perhaps this was the direction he'd like his life to take.
Even when we were together, occasionally he would say something like, oh, one of these days I might just take my typewriter and go bush and try and write.
Well, later on in life, he wrote a whole novel. It was just a whodunit, really, I think. And he read little excerpts to me, and I can't remember what the story was. And then, in a fit of annoyance or something, he just dumped the whole lot of the rubbish and after it was finished, the whole manuscript.
The throwing away of a novel or the throwing away of a work would indicate that he's dissatisfied with himself and he's to some extent disappointed with what he's achieved in that piece of writing, which again seems a reflection of how he feels about the course of his life.
In 1980, his mother died, and in 1983, his grandmother, Honey, who'd brought him up, passed away.
I think he had a chip on his shoulder, really, because of the fact that he didn't really have a home life as a youngster. The fact that he came from wealthy parents on both sides, but he had ended up with none of it.
With no children and his marriage over, John now had no immediate family members. By 1984, John's life was reaching something of a crisis, which some suggest led to his suicide. The concrete business was in a slump, and he was forced to sign half of Minimix over to an unsympathetic creditor. This new business partner then accused him of stealing $15,000 from the company.
He was very upset. He was think it was beyond his comprehension that he would be accused of doing that. I think regardless of anything else, John was muddled in his business dealings, maybe, but he most certainly was not a dishonest man.
3 days before he went missing, John was shocked when police investigators turned up to his house with a search warrant.
Whether this was another added insult to him that pushed him over the edge, no one knows, but it certainly wouldn't have helped.
His integrity was in question, and his reputation was in question, and his family's reputation, and to him that was a very important thing. He was the English gentleman.
He was very upset that he might have sullied the family name, really. But I do think that if he'd wanted to disappear, then maybe that would have been a motive that he would not have wanted to bring his family into disrepute.
Who knows what our breaking point is? None of us know that. And I don't know. I mean, he was pretty distressed about the whole thing. He was pretty upset. If he thought that, that he was going to get stitched up or found guilty or whatever, then who knows what he would have done. You have to, if you knew John as we saw him, you would have to see that he could be very fragile. He was quite a fragile person in that sense. So much in all as we may laugh about the funny things that he did, there was a very sad side to him.
He was a single man entering his 50s without much in the way of financial backing. He had, in essence, no family, no job and no prospects to look forward to. On the other hand, he felt that he probably was worth more, if you like. So there's quite a disjoint between what he thought he should have and what he ended up having. And that clearly has created some tension. And it seems like it's the sort of psychological tension that was weighing very heavily on him.
The day after the police removed company records from his house, John called his ex-wife, Annette.
He said, can I borrow the Holden? It's got a tow bar on it. I need it to tow my boat around. I want to launch my boat. And I said, what, you're just going out sailing? No, he said, I'm going to sail to South America. He said, of course I won't make it. And I said, well, that's a pretty stupid thing to do, isn't it? So he seemed to be sort of down and depressed. I said, look, if that's what you want the car for, no, you can't have it. But I'll bring down a bottle of wine and we can talk about it. So I went down to his flat. He was wrapping up a silver coffee urn that was his family's, and he was going to send it to a friend, a mutual friend in Waiheke Island. He valued this and he knew it was worth a little bit, that he wanted to give something to her.
Annette was stunned that night when John showed her a gun.
What are you doing with a gun?
He never had a gun when we were together, put it that way. He was never interested in going out shooting or anything like that.
But the evening took a turn for the better when they were interrupted by a telephone call.
It was from the Dominion newspaper in Wellington, and he had applied for a job up there, and they actually rang him to tell him that he had it. So his mood changed completely from being way down in the dumps to being, oh, everything's great, this is what I'm going to do, this will be fine, I'll shift up there, and all of that stuff. And so I went home quite pleased with the fact that, the situation was now resolved, that he was in a much better frame of mind.
And to others, the new job also seemed to have turned John's life around.
I remember this weekend so well. He rang me up on the Thursday night and said, well, I'm getting out of the business and I've got a job in the Dominion in Wellington. And I said, well, you better come round for a meal on Tuesday night. It was on the following day, or maybe on the Sunday, that I read in the newspaper where he had gone missing in Littleton Harbour.
if you work through the theory that John was going to commit suicide because he was a single man without financial means and bereft of a job, it seems strikingly unusual that at the same time he would have applied for jobs. And if his disappointment was around his lack of achievements, you would have thought that gaining what seemed to be a reasonably important job would have perhaps given him more sustenance or protected him from committing suicide. The fact that he accepted the news to an observer with joy also tends to indicate that that should have been a predictive factor.
The question remains as to whether John Buxton was suicidal or not when he went boating on Littleton Harbour. The final clue we have to his state of mind is a letter he posted the day he disappeared. On the 1st of June 1984, John Buxton borrowed a friend's car with a tow bar so he could take his boat for a sail. He delivered a box of papers and his beloved typewriter to his accountant and then drove to Diamond Harbour. He sent a package with a family heirloom and a letter to an old friend. This letter is the last clue as to John's state of mind before he went missing. Using the scan or scientific content analysis technique, ex-SIS man Craig Gubbins has studied this letter.
People don't tell you everything when they speak and when they write a statement. They enter an editing process. They tell you as much information as they think is necessary to convey the information, but quite often there's further information within the statement. Pronouns are a really good indicator of commitment to a statement. When you say I or me or my, you leave the reader in no doubt that you're talking about yourself. If there are no pronouns in a statement, you have to wonder why. Why is there no commitment to the statement?
On the face of it, the letter was a suicide note, and that is what authorities accepted it as.
Dear Joan and Bob, this is a very difficult letter for me to write. First, because I don't know as I begin it just what I intend to do despite carefully laid plans.
The statement does not reflect reality. The statement is only what the person has decided is important to mention. So if we look a little more closely at this first sentence, he says partway through, but if I do post it, the action will be nearly the last part of an irrevocable decision to die now. And what's interesting here is he says the action and not my action. So there's no commitment to the action here. He's not saying my action, he's saying the action. And further on, he says the last part of an irrevocable decision to die now, and not my last part of an irrevocable decision to die now. And so the absence of the possessive my indicates a lack of commitment in this part of the letter. The other interesting part of his letter that I found interesting was on page 2 at the top.
I still have my little sailing dinghy, and I plan to set off at the first favourable high tide and sail out to sea, and then, when far enough from land to slip over the side and to let the little boat sail on, untended from me.
What makes this so important is that he speaks about slipping over the side, and that could mean that he's slipping over from life to death, but it could be that he is only going to slip over from his current life into another life. If he had said anywhere in his letter, I'm going to kill myself, we would accept that. It suggests that he might do that, but he doesn't say it. And because he doesn't say it, I certainly could not say it. But what I can say that nowhere in the letter did he say that he is going to kill himself.
So was this simply a case of suicide? Looking back after John went missing, his friends recalled an odd incident earlier that year when he drastically altered his appearance.
John, what on earth have you done to yourself? And he said, when you're looking for a job, he said, some employers don't like men with beards. So he said, I've shaved it off. He said, you better chance of getting a job then.
I remember he came around to our place one day after he'd shaved it off, and he's walking up the drive, and Mum said, who's this stranger coming up the drive, you know?
He was unrecognisable, completely unrecognisable. If you walk past him in the street and never know it was him.
When he had his beard shaved off and got the contacts in, I thought, oh, you've got another passport. You know, it just flashed through my mind.
Oddly, John grew his beard back straight away, supporting the theory that he was organising a new identity. In 1993, 9 years after his disappearance, John was declared dead. However, that year his stepfather, Ben Host, also claimed to have seen John in Auckland.
He said he looked right at me and he said it was John. But I am very sceptical of that, really. He was well in his 80s.
Police found nothing from this lead, and Ben Host has since died. However, we have uncovered another sighting, which was never brought to police attention. This was in London just 4 years after John went missing. John Buxton went missing in June 1984. He may have drowned at sea, but no body was ever recovered, and some evidence points to John having staged his own disappearance. In 1988, there was a sighting of John in London.
You know, obviously knew John was gone, and then there was some conjecture because no body had been found and no trace, and I was just walking down the street, I think it was Cheapside, and I see this guy looking at me. I look at him and I thought, gee, that looks like it could be John Buxton. And there was sort of almost a look of recognition and sort of a furtive look, and then I turned back and he was gone. Knowing the guy, could he have disappeared and gone away to England and started life anew? Yes, I think he would have had the capacity to do that.
We engaged forensic artist Jonathan Christensen to create a picture of what John Buxton may look like if he is still alive today.
Research suggests you're recognising them from the triangle that forms between the eyes and the nose and the upper portion of the mouth, and that everything else is quite peripheral to that recognition triangle. So it doesn't really matter what the ears are doing. You can ignore hairstyles, you can take beards on and off. People are mostly looking at that structure of the eyes, the nose, and down to the mouth.
His first step is to sketch a picture of John Buxton around the time he went missing. Then Jonathan re-sketches the picture, adding on the ears.
As men age, the fleshy parts of the nose continue to enlarge, the ears continue to enlarge. In both men and women, the lips become thinner and start to turn inwards a bit more, and the jaw tends to protrude slightly more. On top of that, you then have to assume a certain amount of cosmetic change, which is what people are more familiar with, the increasing number of wrinkles and lines and gradual sagging of the soft tissue of the face. And that is much more dependent on circumstances and environment. If the person is a smoker, if they've been outdoors a great deal, then they may age more quickly. But the structural changes of aging are actually fairly constant.
Once the face is complete, Jonathan adds a beard, which John Buxton usually wore, giving a picture of the missing man at age 75. Despite possible sightings, nothing has been heard from John Buxton since the day he went missing. John's friends thought he wouldn't be able to help himself, and he would have to leave a clue if he is still alive.
It's not like him not to contact someone. You just have to tell someone where he was. Send them a postcard or something cryptic, we always thought. Intelligent cryptic.
Every Christmas that came by, we thought, wonder if we'll get a card. Still thought he was alive.
If he'd gone to live in the south of France, I would have expected at some stage to get a card from guess who. Not necessarily signed, but I would recognise John's writing anyway. But it never came.
If you accept that you'd stage your own disappearance and you wanted to succeed at something, putting your hand up and identifying where you are would give the game away. On the other hand, his friends considered him to be impulsive enough that they thought he wouldn't be able to help himself. And that's interesting, and I guess that's just another factor you have to weigh into the equation. Because clearly if he has staged his own disappearance, He's done it jolly well, because he's been not heard of.
There is nothing in the records to indicate John tried to formally change his name, and police have established that no New Zealand or British passport has been used by this John Buxton since he disappeared.
If you think about it, I mean, he left no trails, and it's quite difficult to do as well. Maybe a bit easier back then when we didn't have all the electronic banking and bits and pieces that we do nowadays.
Incredibly, a search on Facebook under John Buxton brought up this man. He is around the right age and looks remarkably like our John Buxton. None of his details are available online, and despite many attempts, he's refused to reveal where he is or who he is. The photo of this John Buxton looks remarkably similar to the aged sketch by our forensic artist. Perhaps this is the cryptic clue John Buxton has left his friends to find him. To this day, there is still no conclusive evidence that John Buxton perished in Lyttelton Harbour, or that he chose to vanish and start a new life somewhere else.
He's either having a great laugh or he's hiding, because he's actually left us in a very dramatic way, which suits his personality beautifully, doesn't it, really? But, you know, I don't know, there's a sadness about it, isn't it? To have a life that he was such a bright man with such wonderful potential and so on, to end so bizarrely.
It was disbelief, really. You still don't really believe it. He's a clever guy. He could fool anyone. He still could be fooling us today.
Maybe he is writing under a pseudonym, and maybe we're reading his books and not knowing that we are. But I hope that whatever he's doing or whoever he's with, I hope he's happy.